Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Yamiche Alcindor, in for Kristen Welker on a historic day here in Washington. Just moments ago, the January 6th committee urged the Justice Department to criminally charge former President Trump for his role in the attack on the U.S. Capitol. The committee voted unanimously this afternoon to make 4 criminal referrals against former President Trump: obstructing an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to make a false statement, and inciting, assisting, or aiding and comforting an insurrection. Committee member Jamie Raskin, who served as an impeachment manager during Trump's second impeachment trial, outlined the severity of that final referral.
An insurrection is a rebellion against the authority of the United States. It is a grave federal offense anchored in the Constitution itself. Anyone who incites others to engage in rebelling, assists them in doing so, or gives aid and comfort to those engaged in insurrection is guilty of a federal crime. The president has an affirmative and primary constitutional duty to act to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Nothing could be a greater betrayal of this duty than to assist in insurrection against the constitutional order.
The referrals came at the conclusion of the committee's final public meeting. And after a nearly 18-month investigation, more than 1,200 witness interviews and depositions, 100 subpoenas, and more than 1 million pages of records. The committee also voted to officially adopt its final report, which is expected to be released on Wednesday. In an executive summary of that report, the committee blamed Trump himself for the events that unfolded on January 6th, writing, quote, "The central cause of January 6th was one man, former President Donald Trump, whom many others followed. None of the events of January 6th would have happened without him." The committee also warned, quote, "A failure to hold those involved in the attack accountable now may ultimately lead to future unlawful efforts to overturn our elections, thereby threatening the security and viability of our republic." Trump, meanwhile, was not the only focus of the committee's criminal referrals. The committee also referred lawyer John Eastman and others to the DOJ for obstructing an official proceeding. And in addition to its criminal referrals, the committee also referred 4 Republican House members, including leader Kevin McCarthy, to the House Ethics Committee for failing to comply with subpoenas. Now, to be clear, these criminal referrals are just referrals. It's up to the Justice Department to decide if criminal charges should be filed, and if so, what those charges are. But as Vice Chair Liz Cheney said today, the committee believes that Donald Trump should never be allowed to serve as president again.
No man who would behave that way at that moment in time can ever serve in any position of authority in our nation again. He is unfit for any office.
Joining us now at NBC's Ali Vitale on Capitol Hill, NBC's Vaughn Hilliard in West Palm Beach, Florida, covering the Trump reaction. Also on Capitol Hill, Punchbowl News co-founder at NBC News political contributor Jake Sherman. And with me on set for the legal angle and the view from the Justice Department are NBC Justice Intelligence correspondent Ken Delanian and Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. attorney and former senior FBI official. He is also an NBC News contributor. So thank you all for being here. Ali, I'm going to start with you. We, of course, got these big criminal referrals from the committee today, but the big question is sort of what is going to be the impact of all of this? Could this be symbolic, or could the DOJ actually take some action here? What are you hearing up on the Hill?
Well, look, Yamiche, the ethos of this committee has been that they're not arguing in a court of law, they're arguing in the court of public opinion. For them, it's always been a question of putting referrals forward that gives some kind of public accountability to these people and to the people who are at the center of the January 6th insurrection. It strikes me, we knew the nature of these referrals from before the committee actually met today because of some reporting that we did here on Sunday. But the fact that they're laying exclusively at the former president's feet a charge of insurrection, inciting or assisting an insurrection, really does speak volumes about the way that this committee has focused its work the entire time that they've been doing the investigating and then the public presentations of what they've found. In each of these committee hearings, they have regularly driven back to the former president, what he was being told by people in his orbit, and what he did anyway. Specifically, the idea that he knew he lost the election and that he went forward with plans to overturn it, false slates of electors, pressure campaigns at the Department of Justice, within his own administration, with former Vice President Mike Pence, and then, of course, culminating with January 6th itself, the attack on the Capitol. All of that underscored by the referrals that were sent today. There's also, though, the question of what we're going to end up seeing once the full report is actually released on Wednesday. We know we're expecting 8 chapters to be in that, but then also the release of multiple other things like transcripts and other documents that we're all going to be poring over, because those are the things that could piece together maybe why they didn't do more referrals. I think one of the cliffhangers here, and I was asking Congressman Raskin about this after, is in the charges that they level on conspiracy and on obstruction, they say that they're leveling those against Trump, Eastman, and others. Those 2 words, and others, are doing a lot of work there, Yamiche. And what I asked Raskin and Schiff afterwards was, will we get a better sense in the report of who those people were? They said yes, but for them, and these are people who are looking at this in some cases as former prosecutors, in Raskin's case, a constitutional law professor, these are the people who they felt they had the most solid footing of evidence for, because again, even though they're not arguing in a court of law, even though these referrals don't carry legal weight, they are arguing in the court of public opinion, and this is what they felt they had enough evidence for to present as a referral to DOJ.
And Vaughn, we saw this committee interview so many people from Trump's inner circle. Of course, former President Trump has been attacking this committee so much. What are you hearing from Trump world down there in Florida? What are you hearing from your sources on the reaction to all of this?
You know, largely there is a great deal of silence, Yamiche. Let's be very forward about this. For an attack on the U.S. Capitol, you know, we heard from Republicans on January 6th itself and in the weeks after, condemning Donald Trump and the role he played in the efforts to overturn the 2020 election. But what you hear now is largely silence from a great majority of Republican elected officials. And as one RNC committee man who I just got off the phone with told me, he said that, frankly, this is a badge of honor for Donald Trump, and that a great number of folks in the Republican Party apparatus, who a large number of them who can give credit to Donald Trump for them ascending to their own posts within this Donald Trump-led Republican Party, that they see that this is one that just emboldens him and really makes him square up in his capacity to go up against Democrats as they're looking for the Republican nominee. As for Donald Trump, I think to that very point here, he has so far put out only one statement on his social media account since the referrals were made to the Department of Justice, and that had to do directly with Liz Cheney. It was, quote, but Liz Cheney lost by a record 40 points. When you're looking at this Republican Party, Yamiche, it is very much one that is much more in his image. That over the last 6 years, he was able, through the course of primaries and past general elections, was able to really make this party one that is loyal to him. And the question is now, where does that go from here? You know, it was Mike Pence, actually, earlier this morning on Fox, who suggested that the January 6th committee was largely a political ploy by Democrats, and that he did not believe the Department of Justice should prosecute Donald Trump. But when you're talking about Donald Trump's own reaction, he largely has not denied the basics of the substance of the allegations and evidence put forward by this committee. More so, it's been about him throughout the last year justifying the actions that were laid out in this anticipated report from the January 6th Select Committee.
And Jake, on there is telling us that former Vice President Mike Pence, he's calling this a political ploy. There are some Democrats who are even worried that this could end up being symbolic, even if this isn't, in their minds, a political ploy. They say that maybe these committee members are speaking to history. What are you hearing from your sources on the potential impact of these criminal referrals and this committee overall?
This is only a political ploy, Yamiche, because Kevin McCarthy decided not to put anybody on this committee in what a lot of people consider to be a major miscalculation of McCarthy's time in the Republican leadership. He decided to not have any pushback, to not have any insight into how the committee operated, and thereby, has no real ability to get back against the process or the substance here. I will say what Ali said is right in that we're going to get the full report, transcripts, and we're going to, for the first time, potentially, be able to see under the hood of this committee, and there will be a whole kind of downstream effect of politics there, because we'll see who the committee interviewed, what they said, presumably, that we don't know. My guess is we're going to be, and I think Ali alluded to this, we're going to be probably not surprised by a ton of this, considering just the amount of hearings, the number of hearings that this committee has had over the last 6 months. This is their 10th and final hearing, so we've heard a lot. But the report will be interesting. And I think, again, going back to what Ali said, I don't mean to give her too much credit, but going back to what Ali said, like, this is putting into history a very monumental and momentous moment in American history. They are cementing, they are documenting an attack on the Capitol, an unprecedented attack on the Capitol. And so while the Justice Department may or may not act on it, the Ethics Committee probably won't act on it, this is probably the most successful congressional committee effort in definitely contemporary time, but potentially ever. That we've never seen anything like this. And this is, it's easy to say this is a blueprint for the future, but it's not. These dynamics will probably never hopefully never rear themselves their heads again. And I think it is, we can't underestimate, understate, or undersell how important and critical this effort has been.
And Ken, as Jake points out, the sort of legacy and historical moment of this, of what we're all living through, there are a lot of Democrats who are hoping that this now goes to your beat, to the Department of Justice. But these criminal referrals have no legal weight. So explain to everyone out there who's wondering, why are we here? What's the point? And is your sense that the DOJ might be influenced, if at all, from this by these referrals?
The criminal referrals have no legal weight. They're largely symbolic. But it's not to say that the committee had no influence on what the Justice Department was doing, because there was a time there where it seemed like the committee was out ahead of the Justice Department in its investigation, and there were clearly some moments during those televised hearings, I know from my own reporting, that really got the attention of people who are working on this criminal investigation, which has now accelerated far past where it was. The Justice Department has a robust January 6th grand jury investigation ongoing, and they have tools at their disposal that are a lot more powerful than what the January 6th committee has, and they'll have the benefit of all the evidence that the January 6th committee has gathered. And so while the referrals don't mean anything in terms of the charging decision the DOJ is going to make, they are well down the track of investigating this case. And at some point, Special Counsel Jack Smith will have to make a decision about whether he decides there are any charges to bring. And
you touched on it, but there's also going to be a lot of evidence given over to the DOJ. How interested is the DOJ in all of that? How much could that impact their work?
Well, they've been interested for a long time in getting their hands on these transcripts, and they haven't gotten them, and that's been a source of frustration at the Justice Department. Now the idea that the committee is going to make all this public is also going to be a source of frustration, because as Chuck Rosenberg will tell us, no prosecutor wants all the evidence in public for the potential defendants and witnesses to see what everyone else said. Now, it may be that in this case, because we already know so much about the evidence, that has less of a factor. But there's no doubt. I mean, this committee investigated for a year and a half, and they produced a huge record of transcripts and interviews, and the DOJ will, to some extent, benefit from that record.
And, Chuck, I want to bring you in. Of course, you've been with us at NBC throughout all of this. I wonder what you make of sort of the decision to make these criminal referrals. And do you think that maybe the lawmakers have proven their point, have really proven their case, rather, in the way that they laid it out?
So I agree with Ken completely. The referrals, as a sort of evidentiary matter, as a substantive matter, as a procedural matter, have no meaning at the Department of Justice. I also agree that it may put a little more heat on the department, but that cuts both ways, Yamiche. Ken was speaking of it, I think, in the sense that it would spur them on to more action or light a fire, and maybe early on that was necessary. But I worry about it also having a different effect, a backfire, if you will. The Department of Justice, I come from there unbiased, but I believe, in my heart of hearts, is independent, apolitical, and wants to be perceived as independent and apolitical. And so receiving a mostly partisan referral from a mostly partisan committee and then acting on it, if indeed they charge people with crimes down the road, may make it look in some quarters like they're doing the bidding of Congress. That's not a good look for the Justice Department. And so because it'd be one thing, Yamiche, if they were referring a case that the Justice Department knew nothing about and would never know about but for the referral. That's clearly not what's going on here. And so I don't think it's helpful.
And Ali, I mean, jump in here when you think about what Chuck and Ken are saying about how much this might not matter to the DOJ. What's your reaction? What are you hearing from lawmakers about that sort of line of thinking? And I also wonder what you make of the House ethics referrals, whether or not that might be being seen as differently from the criminal referrals.
Well, of course those are being seen differently. I mean, look, we'll take it in both parts, right? What Ken and Chuck are talking about here is the concern within DOJ that this could, as Chuck is saying, make this look in some ways partisan. What the committee has really tried to do, and it's impossible to make everything, devoid of politics in this day and age, because politics is so inextricably linked with everything that happens regarding the former president. But the committee has tried to argue that this is less about the politics of Trump and more about the ethos and the moment of American democracy. They have tried to elevate this as best they can above the petty partisanship that often takes over on Capitol Hill. The reality, of course, is that none of the people on this committee are friendly to the former president. And I think to Jake's point, this is the miscalculation on the part of Republicans for not putting people on the committee when they had the chance, because this is a committee the likes of which you'll never see again. The fact that they got to present the narrative that everyone on the committee wanted, there was no moment of cross-examination from people on the dais who didn't want the narrative that this entire committee was pushing towards. That's the way most normal committee hearings are. You hear from one side, you hear from the other side, they both talk to the witnesses, they each have points to make. That is not what we saw with the January 6th committee, and it's so unique. The other point on the ethics committee referrals, and everyone up here in Congress will tell you this, is that the Ethics Committee is slow-moving, but also it's split between Republicans and Democrats, and they've only got about a week left of legislating up here. So in the same way that this committee has always been up against the clock, certainly they are up against the clock on these Ethics Committee referrals, and the fact that they're doing so at the end of the year means we're not likely to actually see anything stem from them. It's also notable that we're only seeing them refer 4 of the 5 members, of course leaving Mo Brooks out of this, but this is sort of, you see the names on the screen there: McCarthy, Jim Jordan, Scott Perry, and Andy Biggs, 4 of the 5 who failed to comply with their subpoenas. A notable final piece to that thread that we've been waiting to see how it wrapped up, but certainly doesn't give them any more answers.
And Vaughn, as we're thinking about all of this, it sounds like a statement coming out from Tony Ornato. Can you talk a bit about that and explain to people who Tony Ornato is, and of course how that maybe connects to Cassidy Hutchinson, which is still explosive testimony that I'm processing. So talk about that.
Right. Tony Ornato was a key figure, particularly around Cassidy Hutchinson, being a corroborator. Much of the conversations that she relayed came directly, she contended, from Tony Ornato. That included the ordeal that she said that she was told about having taken place there after Donald Trump delivered his speech at the Ellipse there, in which there was an altercation of sorts inside of the motorcade in which Donald Trump, as she said that she was told, demanded that he be taken to the U.S. Capitol. But now Tony Ornato's lawyer is out here with a statement to NBC News, and I just want to read this here in quote. It says, Mr. Ornato remained cooperative during the entirety of the committee's investigation and testified truthfully before the committee on 3 occasions. It is clear from the introductory material to the final report that the committee did not fully appreciate or understand Mr. Ornato's role and responsibilities as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. Most of the committee's questions were about emails that he has neither sent nor received. It is also clear that they did not fully appreciate or ignored Mr. Ornato's testimony regarding the president's request to go to the Capitol. Now, Tony Ornato used to lead the Secret Service detail for Donald Trump before he entered the staff and became Deputy Chief of Staff to President Trump there in late 2019, and that is why he was such a pivotal figure in this. After Donald Trump left the White House, he then returned to Secret Service before retiring this fall after Cassidy Hutchinson's damning testimony, in which she relayed conversations that she said took place between her and him.
Well, an important update, and Ken, I want to come back to you. What more could we still learn from this report? There's the executive summary, but what else could come from this?
I'll tell you what I didn't see in the executive summary, and we were hoping to see, is any explanation of why the FBI, the Secret Service, the Capitol Police failed to act on the intelligence that the report goes into at length, that there were people coming to the Capitol on January 6th to do violence. That was part of the charter, the resolution that created this committee. They were supposed to look into that. I know for a fact that an entire team of investigators spent the last year and a half looking at it. They have some findings. We didn't see any reference to that in this executive summary released today or at the hearing. Now, it's possible it'll be included in the larger report, so that's one thing that I'm looking for.
And briefly, Chuck, talk to us a bit about how we might be able to still be, I guess, be kept in the dark now that it's the DOJ's work that will be going on here.
Sure. I mean, that's where the action is now. But you ought not see it. Yamiche, and that may be frustrating to journalists and viewers, but if an investigation is done properly and lawfully, it's done quietly and secretly. And so my hope is that there's a serious ongoing investigation. We have every reason to believe that there is, and that we know nothing about it until the Department of Justice speaks in court, which is where they ought to speak.
So we're going to be waiting for a while to hear what comes next.
Well, I don't know when something comes next, but this department has been very good about not putting statements out and leaking matters to the press, maybe to Ken's frustration, although if anyone's going to get it, it'll be Ken. But if done well and if done right, it's done secretly and quietly.
And Ken, it sounds like I'm just going to wrap to you. Tell me a little bit about whether or not this might impact, I guess, if President Trump running might impact sort of the DOJ's investigation or their decision, because there was some feeling that former President Trump got out there early so he wouldn't be indicted.
And the result of that was the special counsel, because that was a close call. There really technically isn't a conflict of interest, but Merrick Garland decided that the right thing to do was to appoint a special counsel. He's not an independent counsel. He still reports into the Justice Department. All the same people who are doing the investigation are now reporting to him, Jack Smith. And Merrick Garland ultimately will have to sign off on the charging decision that he makes. And we'll hear about it. He'll have to write a report to the Attorney General about his charging decisions. But that has largely been the result of Trump's candidacy, and I don't think there will be any other implication from it.
And Jake, tell me a little bit about what comes next year. You have House Republicans coming in. Many of them denied the results of the 2020 election. They're vowing to do their own investigations. What are you hearing about whether or not there might be even a little bit of revenge there, or maybe just like a completely new focus for Congress?
There's going to be a revenge. I have to imagine that, if take Adam Schiff for one, he won't be on the Intelligence Committee, which isn't directly related to this, but there's been talk about retribution to Benny Thompson, the chair of the committee. I have doubts that they'll actually do that. Republicans will actually do that. Kevin McCarthy sent a letter asking for the January 6th committee to preserve documents. It's mostly for show. The committee is not going to go and light their documents on fire. They're going to preserve them either way. But we'll have to see what McCarthy decides. I mean, he could decide to launch an investigation into security failures on January 6th. Republicans have been very adamant, I would say, that Nancy Pelosi did not provide adequate security on January 6th, which is completely wrong. We know that Donald Trump did not ask for National Guard or approve National Guard to the Capitol. We know the real story here. But listen, there's a whole host of people in the House Republican Conference, people that Allie and I cover every day, who believe that January 6th was a minor incident that has been overblown by the press, which is complete nonsense. I was here. It was not minor. It was not overblown. But the investigation story is one of the big stories we're going to be covering over the next 2 years, Yamiche, and I think it will touch in some respect on January 6th.
Well, Allie, Vaughn, Jake, Ken, Chuck, thank you all for joining on such a historic day. And coming up, reaction from both sides of the aisle on today's historic move by the January 6th committee to issue criminal referrals against the former president and his top allies. Plus, Russia aims yet another barrage of strikes at Kyiv as the United States finalizes plans to send Patriot missiles to Ukraine, a move Putin has already warned he will view as a provocation. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. We now have our first look at the executive summary of the long-awaited January 6th report as the committee announced their criminal referrals of former President Trump, among others, to the Department of Justice. But the impact of the January 6th committee's work may be blunted by Republicans taking control of the House in January. That's a live picture, by the way, that you're looking at right now of the beautiful sunset behind the Capitol right now. Joining me now to discuss this, Democratic Congressman from Rhode Island, David Cicilline. Thank you so much for being here. So tell me a bit about these referrals and the impact that they might have, the significance, given the fact that some are already saying, what's the point if they don't have any legal weight?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. As you said, the executive summary is 154 pages. So I think the January 6th committee has done extraordinary work. This was a very thorough review of all of the facts and circumstances. And they had a responsibility, once they came upon evidence of criminal conduct, to make a referral to the Department of Justice. Obviously, the department will make its own judgment through the independent counsel or the special counsel. But it carries some weight. It's a collection of evidence that they will also make available to the Department of Justice of serious criminal wrongdoing. And they're going to make their report available, obviously, to the public and all the supporting materials. So this was a very historic development by the Select Committee. They did an extraordinary job. And now it's up to the Department of Justice to make a judgment about the criminal prosecution of the president and others.
And Congressman, what will you do, though? You're talking about it being significant. What will you do if the DOJ doesn't follow through? What's the plan after that?
Well, I mean, look, the good news is the Department of Justice is an independent agency of the federal government. They will make their own determination based on the facts and the evidence, and that's our system of justice. It's a good thing that we have an independent attorney general. He's appointed a special counsel. So that special counsel, Jack Smith, will look at the evidence and will make a determination as to whether or not criminal charges should be brought. The good news is they don't care what I think, although I think the evidence is overwhelming that the charges ought to be brought. But the good news is they have to make that judgment independently, and they don't care what we think, and that's exactly how it should be.
And Congressman, I want to put up a graphic. 156 Republicans are coming into the 118th Congress who have either cast doubt, questioned, denied the results of the 2020 election. I wonder, what do you expect from these lawmakers, given the fact that they, in some ways, are believing the lies that the January 6th committee just said were so dangerous?
Yeah, well, it is very dangerous. You know, as the Select Committee has pointed out, and as we all know, your right to vote is sacred, and your right to have your vote counted is essential to the functioning of our democracy. And this effort to subvert that and overrule the will of the American people and substitute their judgment is very dangerous for American democracy. And the good news is the Department of Justice, although they may try to impede their investigation or try to interfere or stop in some way, they have independent authority to do their work, and the rule of law will depend on their commitment to that obligation. So whatever the evidence is, the law will be applied, and they will do what is necessary to confirm and to really protect the rule of law in this country. It's disappointing that people are denying the election results were elected to office, but we're going to have to stand up and take that on and point out the truth and make it clear why it's so important that we secure our elections and that people continue to have the right to vote and have their vote counted.
But there are some who are just wondering, can Congress really function like this? And what do you expect when you're going to be serving alongside many of these people?
Well, look, we just finished 2 years of delivering extraordinary achievements for the American people. We're going to continue to fight as Democrats for the people of this country to help improve their lives by bringing down costs, bringing down the cost of health care and prescription drugs, and making sure people have access to good-paying jobs. And the Republicans are going to do what they do. They're going to have investigations about Hunter Biden's laptop and about the condition of the prisons in the District of Columbia for people who are arrested for attacking our democracy. But we're up for that fight. We're going to keep fighting hard to deliver for the American people. And I think the Republicans are going to show who they really are. And we'll take the House back in 2 years, and that will be the result.
And you have a bill that would bar former President Trump from running for office using a clause in the 14th Amendment. If the former president is prosecuted, are you going to withdraw that bill? Do you want to still see that bill go through?
No, look, the 14th Amendment makes it very clear that if you have engaged in an insurrection or assisted others in the same, you are disqualified from holding federal office. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment then says Congress has the responsibility to enact legislation to enforce that provision. It is very clear that the president engaged in an insurrection and he's disqualified from holding federal office, and the Constitution calls on us to pass legislation to enforce that. If he's convicted of that, obviously that happens automatically. But this legislation was introduced because the evidence had been presented that shows that he did engage in an insurrection, and he's disqualified under the Constitution. We took an oath to the Constitution. We're required to enforce its provisions. We can't pick and choose. And the former president, is disqualified under the very language of our Constitution from ever holding federal office again.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Congressman. And joining me,
pleasure.
Thank you. And joining me now, the former Republican Congressman Reid Ribble of Wisconsin. He was part of a bipartisan group of former lawmakers who have called on the Office of Congressional Ethics to investigate sitting members who played a role in the January 6th and in all of the events leading up to January 6th, including the Capitol attack. So, former Congressman, your reaction to these criminal referrals, were they necessary, you think, or do you think that this maybe some Republicans are saying it's a political ploy? What do you think?
No, I think the criminal referrals were necessary. The real thing, the big advantage, I think, on the criminal referral is it opens up the door for the Department of Justice to get these thousands and thousands of pages, maybe millions of pages of documentation, evidence that the committee has gained over the last 2 years, and that's significant. Up until this point, the committee was reluctant to turn over a lot of that information to DOJ. And now they're going to have access to all that information. I think that that's kind of where the rubber will hit the road as the criminal referral goes. Now, DOJ, being independent, will make their determination based on the evidence that they have and whether they believe they can actually make a case. We heard Vice President Pence today say, well, the president was just taking advice from an attorney, and that's not criminal to take advice from an attorney. But yet we've got other judges that would say, well, the attorneys acted in a criminal fashion. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens as a result of this. And
you've also, thinking about results and what comes next, you've also, along with a number of other former lawmakers, you've called for an ethics investigation into some sitting members over their roles in January 6th. Now, of course, the committee has referred this to the Ethics Committee. I wonder what you make of that decision. Do you think it was the right one, or do you think maybe that this is the wrong one? Because, of course, Congress is going to be wrapped up here soon, and nothing is going to happen because Congress is coming to an end so soon.
Yeah, it's symbolic, and we have to recognize that it's symbolic. But I think that symbolism is significant because it gets put into the congressional record and is part of the documentation. And I considered a lot of these folks my friends when I was there. But the reality is, they're complaining that the other side of the story was never told, and yet they all denied subpoenas to come and tell the other side of the story. They could have come before the committee and given whatever side of the story they wanted the committee and the American people to hear. And they chose not to. And so I do believe that the referral is significant. It's important that it happened, but we're not naive. We understand that it's not likely to have anything happen as a result of it. There's just no time.
And in talking about time, the reason why there's no time is because Republicans are, of course, going to be taking control of the House in January. As I mentioned, 156 Republicans who are going to be serving in Congress, they cast doubt on the 2020 election or denied it altogether. I wonder whether or not you think this could be the end of accountability, or what comes next as you have so many lawmakers coming into office or staying in office who question the results of the election.
Yeah, I take that with a bit of a grain of salt. They're basically mimicking or saying what they needed to say to voters to get them to cast that vote for them, because that's what voters wanted to hear. But yet none of those people actually really believe this. If they did, they'd have to reject their own elections because they were on the same ballot. And so the fact of the matter is that they're saying what they need to say to be elected, but they don't really believe it, nor did Donald Trump believe it, I don't believe. He knew that he lost the election, and these many members of Congress also know that the election was fair, and that Joe Biden was elected president in 2020. And it's part of the reason that the midterms did not go the way the Republicans thought it would, because they keep looking backwards rather than looking forwards. They're not talking about governments. They're talking about investigation. And that's just not going to resonate, particularly with independent voters.
And talking about independent voters, but also Republican voters, how much of a hold do you think former President Trump has on the party now when you think about the fact that there are Republicans who have become more vocal in criticizing him after the losses in the midterms?
Well, it's certainly less than what it was. You know, it's too bad that all of the nonsense that went on during President Trump's 4 years with, you know, insulting Gold Star families and insulting prisoners of war, and et cetera, that it took losing. The one thing Republicans won't tolerate is losing. And President Trump lost. A lot of his statewide candidates lost. His Secretary of State candidates lost. And Republicans don't cater to losing. And so I think that President Trump's grip is weakening and is getting weaker by the day.
And as you talk about that, Republicans are also promising to not do what you just talked about, which is focus on kitchen table issues and focus on policy. Instead, they're talking about that they're going to have their own investigations when they can take control of Congress. How much of a mistake is that? Is that a mistake at all, or do you think that's the right direction?
Well, I think there's an oversight role that Congress should play. And so I think they need to do oversight of the executive branch. I think that's part of it. They've got the power of the purse, and they need to know what's going on. And so I think oversight is just part of what they do. However, if that's all they talk about, if they don't talk about inflation, if they don't talk about taxes, if they don't talk about the debt, and if they don't try to do something about those things, it'll just be old news. And at some point, the American people just tune it out and turn it off. And so they need to be forward-thinking and forward-looking and do whatever investigations they're going to do, but then move on with governance.
Well, former Congressman Reid Ribble, thank you.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
And up next, as we've said, nearly 2 years after the January 6th insurrection, many Republicans still deny what happened that day and still question the results of the 2020 election. What does that mean for the legacy of the January 6th committee and the future of our politics? The panel is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
We've never had a president of the United States stir up a violent attempt to block the transfer of power. I believe nearly 2 years later, this is still a time of reflection and reckoning. If we are to survive as a nation of laws and democracy, this can never happen again.
Welcome back. That was January 6th Committee Chair Benny Thompson on the importance of the committee's work in continuing to protect democracy. But as we just mentioned, all of the committee's findings and criminal referrals could be purely symbolic until the Department of Justice decides it will follow through on any indictments, leaving the impact of the report up in the air. I'm joined now by today's panel, host of NPR's Weekend Edition Sunday, Ayesha Rascoe, Navin Nayak, president of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and Republican strategist and NBC News political analyst Rick Tyler. So, Ayesha, the final meeting, or final hearing, we should say the final meeting of the January 6th committee has taken place. We know that these criminal referrals are just referrals. They don't have legal weight. Some people are just asking, is there a big point to this? Is there a big significance to this? What's your takeaway?
I mean, I think the point is for history, right? I think the point is laying out the information that Congress needed to look into this, that this was something that you couldn't just let go. I mean, this was a riot. This was an insurrection. This interfered with the peaceful transfer of power, and that you had to get a record of what happened. I also do think it has damaged Donald Trump. Yes, the number of people who feel like he was mostly responsible for January 6th has gone down. I think it's in the lower 40% now. But still, like, the popularity of Trump has diminished. And I think that January 6th and the committee has a lot to do with that.
And Navin, Ayesha just said they were talking a lot to history. There are some Democrats who definitely say that. They also say that they're hoping the DOJ will look at these referrals and might have some impact on where they go next. What's your takeaway on today's criminal referrals?
Well, even more broadly to your first question, I actually think that the committee has done the country a great service. We had a pretty horrific, terrifying, undemocratic moment, and to have not stimulated a conversation with the country. I mean, they've provided a lot of information and they captured the country's attention. And accountability happens in a lot of ways. DOJ certainly has a role, but we saw some level of accountability at the ballot box. And I actually think the January 6th committee putting this topic front and center not only had consequences for Donald Trump, but I think there's still a reckoning in the Republican Party that has yet to come, and we saw a little bit of it in November.
And Rick, talking about a reckoning in the Republican Party, of course, it's your party. So tell us a bit about what you make of this committee's legacy. Are they talking to the DOJ, history, both, maybe Republicans?
I think we're missing the story. I mean, I get the legal analysis, but thanks for the constitutional lesson. The Congress doesn't have prosecutorial power. Okay, we got that out of the way. Everybody knows that. That's not what the Congress was doing. The Congress was laying down a marker to first establish that this was an insurrection that has serious consequence. And if we erected monuments to shameful people in the city, we would have a monument of shame that's as large as the Washington Monument with Donald Trump's name on it. That's what this committee established for all history. It will not be remembered as a partisan committee. It'll be remembered as a bipartisan committee with a bipartisan outcome that concluded that this country was in danger of an overthrow by insurrection. And we came that close to it, and it can't happen again. Politically, yes, I agree that Donald Trump has been diminished by all this because people are saying, you know, we're done with Donald Trump. My party is starting to finally maybe move on from Donald Trump. But I think this committee did very important work. I don't think we should try to diminish it. I don't think we should get rid of the word symbolic. It's not symbolic. What this committee did was significant. It had a record. It's as powerful as the Tower Commission or the investigation of Watergate. It will go down in history. Every historian will study it. This is what President's legacy is about, and it's one of shame.
Ayesha, what's your reaction to what Rick is talking about, especially as we know there are a number of Republicans, some who were attached to Donald Trump, but some who aren't, who are coming to Congress and are going to have control of Congress next Congress?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have a lot of Republicans right now who want to act like this isn't happening, right? Like they want to try to go ahead and say, let's talk about Hunter Biden, let's talk about all these other things. We don't want to talk about January 6th. Of course, the problem is that Donald Trump is not going to allow that to happen. He is not going to go quietly into the night, although some people may want him to. He is going to continue to talk about this, and he's going to continue to talk about the 2020 election. I mean, you and I both covered Donald Trump. We saw that he won in 2016, and he didn't let that go. Like, he was mad about that, and he won. He's not going to let go of 2020, and he's going to keep talking about it, and these issues aren't going away. Like, the issues of accepting the results of an election and not saying it was stolen from you, that has not gone away.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I think we kind of know how Donald Trump is going to respond. We've seen it for many years. I still think the outstanding question is, how's the rest of the Republican Party going to respond? Right? The committee put down a marker. They spent a year looking at this, and they believe that the DOJ should be prosecuting Donald Trump for criminal activity. And yet the Republican Party is not saying, wait a second, the head of our party was involved in crimes, and we think that's a problem. They're all either quiet or actually criticizing the committee. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for them if they continue to be silent when you actually see the DOJ proceed with this.
And Rick, former Vice President Mike Pence, he's saying that he's hoping the DOJ doesn't bring charges against Donald Trump. How much of a reflection is what Pence is saying, the stance of the Republican Party on the whole?
Look, I don't know what Pence is thinking, whether he may be thinking political for support. I wish we just let it go, just cut it out like a cancer and get rid of it. But look, you know, I do worry about DOJ's investigating former presidents. I do think in this case it reaches the standard. The bar should be really high. And I also agree with that. Maybe we made a mistake with Nixon. Maybe a preemptive pardon should have always been questioned, and it wasn't. And it was partly because the country wanted to heal from that. And the country did heal. It took a long time. This has been inflicted. The country will heal again. But I think in this case, the Republican Party does need to acknowledge that this was an insurrection led by someone who incited it. He is guilty of that, and he should be held accountable to that. And only then, I think, can we move beyond Donald Trump.
Well, I think the problem for Republicans is that there is a very large part of their base, or a significant enough part of their base, that is not ready to let Donald Trump go. And they don't want any apologies for January 6th. They don't want any apologies for the behavior. And so that's why you see Pence and others kind of walking this tightrope. I mean, Pence, his life was in danger.
That tightrope leads to lost elections. It led to losing the House, losing the Senate, losing the Senate again.
So that's the question. Does it lead to lost primaries?
We'll see. We'll see if McConnell decides that he's not going to put up with outsiders picking losing candidates.
I mean, that's why we bring Ayesha on, because she asked a good question.
Ayesha, I have to jump in.
I mean, it's the question that needs to be asked. I have to ask you, Ayesha, there were other names on here, right? It's not just Donald Trump. He's obviously the big name, but there are John Eastman, and then there's the others that we're still waiting on. Yeah. What do you make of the fact that there are other people that will be criminally referred to the DOJ here?
Well, I think those people are probably less concerned. I think those people can kind of use it to burnish their, credentials. Look, the liberals came after me and they said that I did this and I stood up to them. I think there is still an appetite for that in parts of the Republican Party. Like, I think that's just the case.
Yeah.
I think the other element here was the referrals to the Ethics Committee for members of Congress. And the reason why I think that's going to be actually really important is we know that Kevin McCarthy and Jim Jordan's top priority is investigations. And the fact that they wouldn't even partake in an event like January 6th, when everyone saw with their own eyes that there was this attack on the country, and they said, no, I'm not going to partake in that, I think really calls into question their own credibility for any sort of investigations moving forward.
And Rick, I mean, while there were a lot of competitive races that election deniers lost, there are at least 156 of them that are going to be serving in Congress. And House Republicans are saying that they're going to focus a lot of their time on investigations. So what you say you want your party to do doesn't seem like they're going to do that. What's your reaction? What are your thoughts?
Look, they can elections are won by talking about the future. They're not won about talking about the past. We should have learned that lesson in 2022. We didn't learn that lesson. This should have been a layup election. All the wind was behind the Republicans' back. When 70% of the country thinks the country's going in the wrong direction, they elect the people who are in charge of the country, it tells you that the Republicans missed the mark, and they missed it by a wide mark. And we can repeat that history, or we can learn our lessons and move forward.
Well, thank you, all of you, Ayesha, Navin, Rick, for joining us. And turning now to the southern border, as 19 attorneys generals from Republican-led states are filing an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court, asking the justice to keep the border policy known as Title 42 in place. The move comes after an appeals court judge denied their stay request late last week. The pandemic-era policy, which allows officials to turn away nearly all migrants, even asylum seekers, at the southern border due to public health concerns, is set to expire this week. Still to come, President Biden prepares to send additional missile systems to Ukraine as Russia launches a new wave of attacks on Ukraine's power grid. The former commander of U.S. Army Europe joins me for more after this quick break. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Russia carried out another drone attack on Kyiv early this morning, the third air attack on Ukraine's capital in less than a week, as Moscow continues to target Ukraine's power grid. According to Ukraine's armed forces, 35 Iranian-made drones were detected in the Kyiv region this morning, 30 of which were shot down. Officials said at least 3 people were wounded and 9 buildings damaged. The attack comes as Russian President Vladimir Putin is in Belarus today, meeting with President Lukashenko. The visit is prompting concerns in Ukraine that the meeting could broaden Belarus's involvement in the war. The Kremlin, however, is dismissing any reports that Moscow is seeking to pressure Belarus into joining what they call a special military operation. Joining me now on set is Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. Army Europe and a senior advisor at Human Rights First. Thank you so much for being here. So I want to talk to you about the plans, it sounds like, that the Biden administration are doing to finalize sending this new missile system to Ukraine. Can you talk a little bit about how significant of a move that might be? Because the U.S. had been wanting to not do this, had been saying that they were going to hold back on this.
So, Yamisha, if the administration does decide to provide the Patriot missile defense system, that would represent a significant upgrade in capability. It is the best of its class for that type of system. But of course, it's not a panacea. It's got to be integrated into other systems as well. But the decision, if the administration does make that decision, I think this is an important step forward.
And how much, if at all, could that be seen as a provocation of Russia, given that the Russians are already putting out statements saying that they'll see it that way?
Well, of course, it becomes a target as soon as it arrives inside Ukraine, just like every other piece of equipment that we have provided to the Ukrainians. So I would assume that the administration has thought that's part of the consideration process, and the Russians will do everything they can to discourage us from providing capabilities to Ukraine.
And you said that this would be really an increase in the capabilities of the Ukrainians. I wonder, though, when I've been reading about these systems, they say that they can effectively protect a small sort of military base, but they can't protect a big city like Kyiv. So how much will this possibly help Ukraine in their fight against Russia?
Well, that's really the key point. The amount that's going to be provided, if the decision is made, probably a battery which has 6 or 8 launchers would be enough, if it's properly integrated into other systems, to help protect a city. So it's a significant step in capability, but it's still way short in terms of capacity.
And this war, there's been a lot of talk of Russia's military capability. What have we learned? What do you know about their weapons stockpile, and how that could impact sort of their ability to continue this war with Ukraine?
Well, of course, I don't know what they started with. That would really be a useful piece of information. We do know that because of sanctions, the precision weapons that they've been using against civilian targets, they cannot replenish those because they had to rely on imported components. Secondly, we know that they are now having to dip into ammunition stocks that are very old. As you probably are aware, explosives have a use-by date. So artillery ammunition that goes past that date, you have a high dud rate, or they blow up inside the howitzer. So they're down having to use that poorer quality ammunition now. So there is an end. I just don't know where that end is.
Yeah, well, you would be definitely someone we would want to know if you knew when the end was coming. That being said, President Putin, as we said, he's in Belarus. What do you make of him meeting with the president there, with the President Lukashenko there, and what could come of that?
So the Russians have not changed their strategic objective, even though they have failed for the past 10 months at achieving their objectives. So the idea of a new offensive that might come from Belarus towards Kyiv or from another part of Ukraine towards Ukraine is designed to distract or divert Ukrainian capabilities from where they're focused now. President Lukashenko in Belarus, who is the illegitimate leader of Belarus, has for years played this game to avoid becoming a subject of the Kremlin, so doing just enough, for example, to allow the deployment of Russian troops and weapon systems in Belarus. I think he does not want to have his own troops involved. They will get crushed by Ukrainian forces in the first days. And he also would expose himself to his own opposition. So I don't know where this goes yet.
And in thinking about we've been talking about Ukrainians' sovereignty. The January 6th committee, of course, is referring its referrals or has referred its referrals to the DOJ. How important is that work when you think of the global landscape here?
What a terrific question. January 6th, one of the worst days of my life. I was I live in Frankfurt, Germany, so to see it from over there was very hard to watch. You know, I've taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States for decades, since I was a cadet. And to see all of that was very hard. Our European friends, my German friends, their favorite sport is not soccer. It's criticized in the United States. But they all hold the United States to such a high standard, and they always assume that whatever our faults were, that you could always count on American democracy as unshakable. And so it's been very difficult to explain what's going on, and it damaged our standing in the world a little bit.
Yeah, and it was certainly something that I think so many people were watching across the country and across the world. So, Lieutenant Ben Hodges, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And thank you, of course, for joining us this hour. We'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.